Good morning, everyone. So my name's 𝗗𝗲𝗲𝗏. I'm the Program Director of the Net Zero Initiative at Monash University, and I'm going to be your host for this webinar today. Thank you all for attending, and we'll have a few more filter in as we go, but I'll get kicked off. So welcome to the Monash Energy Institute webinar series. This webinar is titled Energy Users, Participation or Not in Automated and Distributed Energy Futures. We've got a great lineup of speakers today who are each going to present in their fields of expertise, and then a good chance for Q&A once we get to the end of this session. I'd like to do an acknowledgement to country to begin. So I'd wish to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations, on whose gloriously sunny land I am situated today, but also acknowledging the lands that others are located on, especially Declan and Sophie being based in Sydney as well. I'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging as well. So this webinar is part of a series being run by the Monash Energy Institute. The Energy Institute is a virtual institute across faculties within Monash that brings the leading researchers together to help accelerate the transition to a sustainable energy future. This is the third or fourth webinar we've run related to net zero focused themes that Monash is undertaking, and a really exciting one from my perspective, given we're going to be focusing not so much on the technologies and the technical transition and some of the business related stuff that we've focused on in the past, but really the users who are essential to this transition, and considering the role of users in this world as we transition to more distributed and more automated energy systems as well. So our panelists are going to provide some insights from the research that they've been doing in this space. And so hopefully we'll be able to share some of their experiences and then have a good discussion once we go. So each of our panelists will have 10 minutes to talk, and then we'll have 20 or so minutes for Q&A at the end. So feel free to enter your questions as we go into the chats, and then we'll collate those and be able to work through those as we get towards the end of the session. So the three speakers we've got today are from across Monash and the University of New South Wales. So Mark Boulet is a research fellow at BehaviourWorks Australia, and he's going to be providing us some information and sharing some of his insights from some work he's done around the Monash microgrid and some trials we ran last summer, and some of the behavioural insights around automation of HVAC control in our buildings. Dr. Declan Kuch and Sophie Adams are from the University of New South Wales, and they're going to be talking about a project which is a collaboration between Monash and the University of New South Wales with the International Energy Agency's User-Centred Energy Systems Technology Collaboration Program. It's a mouthful. They've been leading a task around the social licence to automate, which they'll share some insights from their research as well. And then we'll finish with Associate Professor Yolande Strengers from Monash University, who's going to share some of the learnings from the Digital Energy Futures research project that the Emerging Technologies Research Lab she's part of has been conducting as well. So without further ado, I'm going to throw to Mark for him to be able to talk you through the work they've been doing. So over to you, Mark.
Thanks, and good morning, everyone, and thanks to Scott and the team for inviting me along. And also, can I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which I'm coming to you from, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations up here in 𝗗𝗲𝗄𝗏, and also pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the lands from which you're all zooming in to today. As Scott said, I come from an organisation called BehaviourWorks Australia. We're a research enterprise at the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. Essentially, we take a behavioural lens to try and address sustainability challenges, which sees us generating, I guess you can call them behavioural insights to help develop behaviour change interventions that then tackle environmental, social or economic sustainability issues. As Scott said, also we've worked with the Monash Net Zero team from time to time over the last few years, but the particular project that I want to talk to you all about is one that we did with their microgrid team earlier this year in February of the past summer. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the project background and the sort of hypothesis that drove the project, share with you at a very high level in the 10 minutes that I have, a couple of, for me, which were the really strong, I guess, evocative outcomes, and then just consider briefly what it means with regards to, you know, the overall theme that this panel has come together to talk about. Now, Scott and his team are going to hate my description of the microgrid, so I apologize in advance. But from what I understand, it's an attempt, I guess, to manage energy demand and energy consumption at a campus level and have a little bit more control over both when and how individual buildings across the campus use their energy. For this particular project, the team was conscious that on days of peak demand, there's probably opportunities to allow building temperatures to increase a couple of degrees beyond the normal cooling band in order to reduce energy consumption within individual buildings, and then to meet the kind of greater energy demand, I guess, that's then in place across the entire campus. So the question that they had that went along with this particular, well, on these days when we do allow building temperatures to increase, how do we actually engage building occupants to on those demand days to actually maximize energy reduction? And in the discussions that we had with them, the question, I guess, that we had at BehaviourWorks was, well, do building occupants actually, A, notice that this is occurring, so that the temperature is increasing? And what types of behaviours are they actually engaging in? Do we know what those are? So let's get a sense of what those are first before we decide how engagement might look like with them, or in fact, if it was even necessary. So the aim was to understand how building occupants actually behave in buildings on those peak demand days when the temperature was allowed to increase a little bit. And maybe the slightly provocative hypothesis that we had at the time was that actually they probably, for a 2 to 3 degree increase, they may not even notice the temperature going up, and they may actually not even change their day-to-day behaviours. And that was what we were trying to test through this small-scale project that we ran then in February to March of this year. And 3 buildings were chosen on the Clayton campus by the microgrid team. So there was a recreation facility, there was one of the residential buildings chosen, and then a large administration and teaching building as well. And over 5 days in February, and those days were chosen on being either very hot days or very humid days, the temperature bands in those buildings were allowed to increase slightly higher than they normally would. So normally the air conditioning in these buildings kicks in, from what I understand, about 20 to 22 degrees when the internal temperature gets to that stage. This was allowed to then creep up on those days to about 24 to 26 degrees. And importantly, building occupants were not told that this was happening, because what we wanted to do was measure their natural response, both from an awareness perspective as well as from a behavioural perspective. And it's also important to note that in these buildings, we only focused on those areas that had Monash staff in them who were typically there for the whole day. So we didn't focus on areas that had a high student use or that generally had high traffic. So we tended to just focus on primarily those areas where people were sitting at their desks in their offices for most of the day. And we're interested, I guess, in, as I said before, in measuring 2 particular aspects. One, do occupants even notice? So their perceptions of the temperature and the thermal comfort within those particular buildings. And then how do they respond behaviourally? Was there an increase in complaints or maintenance requests that either went to the building manager or to the centralised facilities and services hot desk? Or was there an increase in cooling devices that were either brought or requested for individual workstations? Or was there a noticeable change in the clothing types that were worn? So, you know, was there a preference then for lighter clothing, short sleeves and shorts? So those are the, I guess, the measures that we were looking for. And we tried to pick those up through about 5 or 6 different data collection streams, which I won't bore you with, but we kind of did both surveys, and then we also, I guess, embedded some data spikes into some of the university's normal sort of maintenance logs and requests so that we could actually see whether or not there was an increase in requests and complaints about heating and cooling. So those are the sort of things that we are trying to measure. And look, we produced quite a detailed report for the team. For me, there were two findings which were particularly relevant for this particular panel, particularly with the mind about, I guess, with our mind towards, well, how do we engage with building users or energy users? And in some cases, is it even necessary? With regards to building users noticing the internal temperature differences, we were forced to conclude by the end of the trial period that there was very little of temperature increase that had actually been noticed. So we conducted a survey in February, again, not telling survey participants that these trials had occurred. And the survey essentially asked them to record their perceptions of both temperature and thermal comfort in those buildings over that particular month. We used a validated scale. You can see on the left-hand side there on the vertical axis, it goes from 0 to 13. Don't ask me why, but that's just what's been used in other studies, so we wanted to follow suit. 7.5 is sort of considered to be neutral, and as we get towards 0, it's considered to be colder, and then obviously towards 12.5, 13 is hot. And you can see that over the month of February, actually, particularly for the administration and teaching building and the residential building, staff perceptions of thermal comfort were actually tending towards the cool side. In the recreational building, it was much more towards the neutral end, although the variation was much higher there. You can see there was a higher sort of variation in perceptions of thermal comfort. But this kind of showed to us that, if anything, in February, which is a peak summer month, in 2 of the 3 buildings that we were measuring, staff were not noticing any increases in thermal temperature, and if anything, were actually going in the opposite direction, and there were complaints about that it was cold. This being a particularly, I guess, evocative open-ended response from one of the participants, who was infuriated that they actually had to bring ski jackets along to wear on a 30-degree day in a building. And when you think about it, you know, building design is, you know, as it starts to become more modern and as newer buildings are brought onto campus, I guess the thermal comfort within those areas, or the thermal bands, will be much more stable. And also, we're asking staff who are primarily stationary, so, you know, who aren't particularly active in their day-to-day at Monash. So it's probably no surprise that their perceptions of thermal comfort would be, if anything, trending towards the cooler side, because they're just not particularly active in their day-to-day while doing work in those particular buildings. From a behavioural perspective, across the 3 buildings, we again had similar sort of trends come up. Unfortunately, in the residential building, there was a little mix-up in the systems, and the heating actually came on during the trial days, which staff definitely noticed. But because that wasn't what was meant to happen, we were forced to discount staff behavioural responses within that particular building, so that we had to take those out from our results. For the other 2 buildings, though, the trends were much the same. There was a couple of requests for maintenance that went through to the main facilities and services desk. We compared those to a similar time in 2019. It was 0 then. During the trial, there were 2 requests. We can't say, obviously, whether those were statistically significant or not, but 2 requests compared to 0 is a pretty small change, particularly when you consider it's over a 5-day trial. Importantly, the building managers in each of those buildings, who are often at the receiving end of any slight hint of staff discomfort or unhappiness, we checked in with them every day. They filled out some observation tables for us. We also had them fill out a survey pre and post each of the trial days, and they were very confident by saying that they received no complaints themselves, and certainly themselves did not notice any of the other changes in occupant behaviours that we were looking for, whether it was more cooling devices to desks, or whether staff actually changed, you know, to lighter clothing and so forth. So again, this, I guess, mirrored what we noticed in the previous one, that there were no perceptions of thermal comfort levels increasing, or sorry, of temperatures increasing in buildings. And as a result, we were also left to conclude that from a behavioural perspective, staff didn't really do a lot that was not ordinary to their day-to-day. And so, you know, to answer our, I guess, the hypothesis that we had going into the study, we were forced to conclude that staff did not notice any temperature increases and did not change their day-to-day behaviours. So our recommendations to the microgrid team were then twofold. It might not be necessarily to do any front-end engagement before a trial or before a peak demand day when you're wanting to allow temperatures to increase a little bit in a building, because staff don't notice anyway. And if anything, it might be counterproductive, because by front-end engagement, you're drawing their attention to something, you're telling them it might be hot, therefore you increase the chances that they might feel hot, and as a result might start to complain even more. So it's not necessary, and if anything, could be potentially counterproductive to what you're trying to achieve within those particular buildings. And what might be more appropriate is one-on-one engagement. For those that do notice, that do complain, that do put in a call for maintenance, they are then explained that on those particular days, the building temperature is allowed to increase, and it might be, and then maybe to recommend some personalised cooling strategies. So rather than a broad scale front-end engagement, one-on-one for those that notice might be more appropriate. And I guess just jumping from those two recommendations to, again, the theme of today's panel, I mean, energy use and energy user engagement would no doubt be heavily contextualized, and what's appropriate in one context will not be appropriate in another context. Based on this particular study, one thing that we then concluded was that when it comes to energy use or engaging building users with regards to energy demand management on peak days, it might not be necessary to actively involve them as much as maybe we would like or think is appropriate, because they don't notice anyway. And as a result, in this particular case, probably you can push the automation agenda a little bit more strongly, because there's not much pushback that will come from staff. So that's it from me. I think I've used up my 10 minutes, so I'll hand over to, I think, to Scott. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Mark. And yeah, been great to have those insights to feed into what we are doing with the microgrid on campus, and then also looking at what further trials can we do over this coming summer as it just starts to warm up in Melbourne. So if you've got questions for Mark, please feel free to put them in the chat and the Q&A box, and we'll come back to those in the discussion at the end of the presentations. So now over to Declan and Sophie from the University of New South Wales, who are going to talk to the social licence to automate task that they're working for under the International Energy Agency's User-Centred Energy Systems Technology Collaboration Program. I love that. Such a mouthful. I think both Declan and Sophie right now, if it was not COVID times, would be over in Europe joining up with the IEA members from across the world who are, I guess, collaborating on some of these issues and trying to get research happening across countries and across jurisdictions as well. So over to Declan. Thanks so much for that intro, Scott. And I'm particularly pleased that you managed to get the mouthful of the IEA TCP out, so I don't have to repeat it several times. Thanks so much to our Monash Energy Institute colleagues for organising the event. And as Scott mentioned, I'm up here on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people in Sydney, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. So we framed this event around participation. Who gets to participate in the energy transition? Who wants to? What kinds of participation are desirable? And as Mark's paper just sort of touched on, how can we design systems to ensure that our cities are livable? So I've got some slides here that I'll just share with you to guide some of the findings we're going to discuss today. Those have come through. Scott, give us a thumbs up if that's all looking good. Fantastic. So our project has really been focused so far on residential air conditioning. And so it was really fascinating to hear some of the findings from this experimentation that BehaviourWorks have been doing down there with the microgrid. And we're also looking at battery discharge. We're looking at people's willingness to have their home batteries controlled, as well as the conditions under which they would purchase one if they're a solar owner. So we'll say a little bit about some of the various projects that we've been collaborating with across the world.
And I thought I'd really start a little bit broader, though, first. So, you know, we can think about the issue and the problem and the question of participation in energy systems as one with an historical arc. And one way of understanding this arc is this fantastic phrase on the IEA's website that they've shifted from an emphasis from securing supply to steering towards secure and sustainable energy transition. And so here's a photo from the signature ceremony of the agreement establishing the International Energy Agency some 46 years ago next week, actually. And the IEA was developed to respond to the oil shocks primarily in the 1970s, and research collaboration was really central to its mission. So we launched the User-Centred Energy Systems TCP last year in Melbourne and up here in Sydney. We had David Shipworth, our wonderful chair, and a whole lot of our fantastic colleagues from around the world. And yeah, as Scott said, we would probably be in Europe, commuting with them again, talking about our research, if not for COVID. And I'll just flag that, you know, the IEA is based in Paris. It has a lot of modelling capacity and a lot of other capacities that means that the TCPs are actually functionally and legally autonomous. So we don't claim to speak for the IEA itself. Now, some of you might be familiar with this term, the energy trilemma, and this has been articulated in a bunch of different ways. And I've just sort of added arrows here to denote the amount of resources, arguably, that have been dedicated to each parts of the trilemma. And certainly in Australia, it feels like the climate and decarbonisation part of the trilemma has a bit of a strike through in some jurisdictions. But this has often been framed in terms of decarbonisation, low cost or security of supply, or we can also think of it as security, sustainability and equity. But it does feel like with the emergence of our technology collaboration programs centering users, that engagement and participation is quite a different strand and quite a new and distinctive strand to this trilemma. And I would even argue that we now have an energy quadlemma that places engagement and participation, as well as the formal dimensions of that through regulation, at the very centre. And often this is tacked on, but I think it's becoming increasingly apparent that we need to really foreground the transition with these insights. So in a nutshell, what we're doing with the collaboration is gathering insights from a number of case studies, which Sophie will run through in a moment. We've got something like 2,300 participants in all of these case studies. Here's some of our Australian community and industry partners. And what we're looking to do is examine the circumstances under which people will trust energy companies to control their devices in their home. And we're really interested in building community capacity here. So understanding and giving voice to people who have concerns about automated control, and ensuring that we have the right institutions to deal with those concerns. And the payoff for this is, a more stable energy system, particularly under a changing climate, and potentially saving a lot of money in energy supply technologies if we can get this right. So there are really substantial stakes here with the very likely dramatic increase in very hot and other extreme weather conditions. So I'll just hand over to Sophie to run through, to put some meat on the bones there, as it were, to just talk about some of our case studies more directly. Thanks.
Thanks, Declan. So in Australia, we've been conducting a study on householders' willingness to participate in a VPP with solar monitoring service provider Solar Analytics. And I'll describe some of our initial findings from that study in a moment. Our colleagues in Austria have been focused on direct load control in the Flex Plus and EU-wide SIM for Blocks project. In the Netherlands, we're looking at smart solar charging at VVs, including vehicle to grid. In Norway, we're looking at managed EV charging in shared residential car parking. In Sweden, we're working with Stockholm DNSP Ellevio to explore attitudes and preferences for different automation scenarios following their second generation smart meter rollout. And in Switzerland, we're looking at the second stage of the 𝗗𝘗𝗲𝗄𝗲 peer-to-peer trading project, as well as a direct load program with 150,000 participants in French-speaking Switzerland. And what we're seeing coming out of these case studies, it's just some initial emerging findings, are that even though automation takes over some of the work of achieving demand flexibility, it still requires capacity, time, and skills to shift loads. And these resources and the willingness to engage with automated demand-side management are unevenly distributed throughout society. In terms of VPP participation, from the study with solar analytics here in Australia, we're finding that people who have solar systems and have a battery or are thinking about installing one tend to see themselves as being on a renewable energy pathway towards greater self-consumption and independence of the grid. And for these people, VPP participation would require quite a significant shift in thinking. They may be open to rethinking what sustainable energy could mean for them. But this is going to hinge on a greater understanding of how a VPP is an alternative way to realise some of those values. It's not immediately obvious to a lot of these people, even some of the more engaged people who are among solar analytics customers, for example. On the other hand, people who don't yet have solar or batteries may be quite receptive to the different meanings that these DER can hold and to VPP participation. And it may be the case that they could be engaged to invest in solar and a battery and participate as a more purely financial proposition. We're also seeing that household participants of direct load control programs may be most easily enrolled if control-enabled appliances are sold to them and installed during home construction rather than requiring a retrofit later purchase. And also the requirement that they change existing energy supplies in order to participate can be an impediment to participation. Back to you, Declan.
Thanks very much, Sophie. Yes, that question of how to do brownfield development keeps coming up over and over again. It's the installation process is really important to all of this, which is one of the reasons we talk about this as a socio-technical transition, right? That this is thinking both about groups and technologies at the same time. So I thought I'd conclude with some provocations here that speak to some of the broader, I guess, structural issues that are often coming up here. So we can frame these in terms of different modes of participation that I think are at stake in this transition and in the role of automated technologies. So to what extent should we think of participation as being social, as something requiring the attention towards different social groups with different needs, rather than just the creation of markets through which incentives can provide a way of structuring policy? So I think one way of articulating this is how can the energy sector go beyond what Yolande Strengers has very productively called resource man. Secondly, what is the status of green consumption in this transition? So, we live in an asset economy, an economy primarily where value is derived from assets rather than other kinds of practices like labour. So, if we think about these distributed energy resources as part of household assets, what are the implications of that for the transition? And what are the tensions with thinking about participation with energy as an essential service? How do we ensure really that the value of all of this distributed energy resources goes to everyone and that it's fair? So thanks again to the organisers, and I'll hand back to Scott and Yolande. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Declan and Sophie. And yes, just a reminder, if you've got questions, chuck them in the in the Q&A, and we can come back to those in the Q&A session once we've heard from Yolande. So now over to Associate Professor Yolande Strengers, who's from the Emerging Technologies Research Lab at Monash University, talking to the work out of the Digital Energy Futures Research Project.
Thank you, Scott. Well, I'm going to kind of take a little bit more of a broader approach now, and I guess get out our crystal ball to think about what the future of energy might look like with more automation and distribution within it, and talk to a couple of our projects actually that have been looking at this issue from different angles. So I want to kind of start with the energy vision of the future that is very common, and some of the essential ingredients of that, particularly for households, involving all of this range of technology and different types of programs that are really designed to use energy more smartly in the home and integrate renewable energy within the home. But simultaneously, there is another sort of vision that is coming and being imposed into the home that is running alongside this one that I think is so important to consider when we're talking about automation and distributed energy futures and participation. And that is the broader vision for the smart home, which is much more about lifestyle improvements, much more about the types of convenience and comforts that people are starting to expect through the use of digital technologies, new and emerging security systems, different forms of entertainment enabled through technologies like virtual reality, aesthetics and mood enhancers through smart lighting, and energy automation and distributed generation being a part often of this much broader set of technologies that are coming into the home. And this is precisely what the Digital Energy Futures Project is interested in, this mixing of different forms of digital and energy technologies and what that will mean for the future of energy demand in this and indeed other countries. One of the reasons we're concerned about this is because there's been considerable social science research that shows that the savings that we've achieved through various types of energy efficiency and demand reduction programs are often overtaken or undermined or changed in some way by different forms of consumption that are taking place in the home, by new and emerging practices that are kind of coming into people's expectations of how they want to live. So Sarah Darby refers to this as savings being steps taken down an upward moving escalator. This idea that our demand is constantly ratcheting upwards, which of course is not exactly what happens. We know that there are energy efficiency gains, but certainly that there are changes that occur that may offset the benefits that we seek to achieve through various types of demand incentives or automation programs. And likewise, some researchers from the UK, Tom Hargroves and Charlie Wilson, who have extensively researched the smart home, have found a similar kind of phenomenon occurring when smart home technologies are brought in to automate the home, but they also bring in all these new lifestyle expectations that potentially undermine those benefits. So that's why it's so important to pay attention to the kind of co-evolving nature of these technologies in relation to the household. So that is something that we're doing in the Digital Energy Futures Project, which is a 3-year Australian Research Council linkage project with partners AusNet Services, Ausgrid and Energy Consumers Australia. And I'm conducting that with my colleagues in the Emerging Technologies Research Lab at Monash University. Now we're sort of part way through the project, so I'm going to give you some emerging insights today, but it is very much an ongoing process and there are a number of different steps to it which I don't have time to go over. But feel free to check out our website where we have the whole research methodology laid out. The central sort of guiding question for this project though is how will people live in the future? So we're interested in how we can better forecast energy demand and also what types of demand management programs or types of automation systems and distributed energy kind of configurations we might be able to see in the future and also encourage in the future to achieve various demand management outcomes or forecasting outcomes. In the first stage of the research, which we have completed, we did a review of what the industry's expectations are for the future. And we looked again at this through 2 different lenses. One through the lens of the digital technology sector and how they predict futures to unfold with emerging technologies like virtual reality and augmented reality, through blockchain technology, through different types of digital voice assistants, for example, and voice configuration of the home. So much more of a kind of broader set of technologies. And we also looked at the visions and expectations that are emerging in the energy sector. And we asked, you know, how do these futures speak to each other? Which, well, I guess the answer to that is they weren't really speaking to each other particularly well. They were kind of giving us parallel visions of the future, but often not converging in terms of their expectations for what the future home might look like. And of course, the big question is, what would the future of the home look like if these mainstream predictions come true? And to envisage that, we prepared a number of scenarios that kind of brought these visions of technology to life. I'm just going to show you one of them, which I think is quite relevant for the discussion today. It's called the set and forget prosumer. And it depicts many things that are actually already occurring. One of the things that we discovered when reviewing all of these reports was that the visions for the future were quite conservative and very much based on technologies that are already emerging, or that indeed many of us already have in our homes. So things like peer-to-peer energy trading and microgrids, automated heating and cooling in the home, algorithms that can determine and optimize temperatures. So yeah, all of these ideas I'm sure are very familiar to everybody on this webinar. And as I said, not kind of radically different from things that we've all heard of before. What we're now doing with these scenarios, and there are 6 of them, so I'm showing you number 6 now, is we're taking them to households themselves, and it's part of a broader methodology where we're asking people about the ways they currently live and also their expectations for the future. We're showing households these industry scenarios, and we're asking them, you know, whether they can see themselves in this vision, whether this is something that they desire for themselves, how else they see their futures unfolding that might be different from these scenarios. And that's really fascinating and revealing, kind of to contrast industry visions with the visions that consumers themselves have for their own futures. So we are in the process of that. We're currently talking to 72 households across AusNet services and Ausgrid's distribution areas. We're in the thick of it, so I don't know if you're familiar with ethnography, but when you're in the thick of talking to that many households and spending hours of your time with them over Zoom, it all gets quite messy. So I'm reluctant to give you any significant insights today. But what I did want to share with you were just some emerging trends that have come out of the first stage of our review and that we're also now seeing in the research we're doing with households that are certainly complicating the types of energy expectations that we might have around automation and distributed energy. And many of these are, of course, resulting from the pandemic that we're all living through at the moment, but also other natural or climate change induced kind of events that have occurred, such as the bushfires we experienced recently. So we're seeing increased working from home and rising unemployment, as we're all testimony today, given that we're all sitting in our homes, either part of this webinar or watching it. And rising unemployment as well, which of course is shaping all sorts of digital home experiences and the ways that we use energy. And we've seen a lot of research come out of that over the last few months. One of the things we're very interested in is the increase in air purification technologies and its convergence potentially with air conditioning technologies as a significant changer of demand. And it's something that it could also alter kind of the usage of distributed energy and automation systems in the home. We're seeing that being installed as a response to bushfire smoke, but also in response to a rise of allergies and asthma-related incidences as well in Australia. Of course, during the pandemic, everyone's been rushing out and buying the latest and greatest gadgets and technologies to keep us all amused and also to work from home. There's been a 20% increase in home goods sales in Australia. In the US, there's a trend towards installing swimming pools. And we have also and are also seeing increased renovations in larger houses, which are also changing expectations for energy. And lastly, entertainment is just, you know, a whole new area. I know it's not one that we focus on very much often with energy because it's often considered to be quite minimal in terms of demand, but there are a whole lot of interesting trends going on there, particularly around the multiplication of devices. And by that, we mean the use of 3 or 4 devices in the one room at the same time. And with something like exercise equipment, the use of heating and cooling in rooms which otherwise it wouldn't have been needed in, to basically establish things like home gyms while also simultaneously using things like TVs and other appliances at the same time. So some interesting kind of trends going on there that could complicate expectations for energy demand and automation in the future. I just want to wrap up by briefly mentioning another project which speaks, I think, to the theme of today, which we finished this one last year. It was funded by Energy Consumers Australia, and it was called Engaging Households Towards the Future Grid. Again, it involved extensive qualitative research with households who either have solar and battery setups or automated systems or some form of demand response. And it was about how we can engage these people to participate more in the visions that the energy industry has for the future. And I just wanted to share a couple of engagement programs that came out of that research, which were exemplar kind of they're examples that we gave to the industry to provoke different ways of thinking about what participation might look like based on how households themselves want or are participating in the future grid scenarios. The first one is called Weather Watches. And this is really about making the connection more transparent between weather data and demand response. Because what we find in households that have these kinds of distributed energy and automated setups is that they typically rely often as much or more heavily on weather information, either accumulated informally or formally through weather apps, to determine when they are going to use their energy. And so there's kind of, a participation role here to play around building capacity and understanding amongst people about this link between high demand and weather. And so the idea here is that there would be a kind of alert that would go out similar to kind of a UV index or a pollen count that goes into the weather forecasts each day that would alert people to the link between an extreme weather day and grid stress, to kind of make that understanding more apparent, building on what the households we spoke to already said they do. And the second idea is a little bit different. This has come from my long-standing interest in pets and increasing thermal comfort needs for pets in Australian households, and which could potentially and significantly change energy demand in this country. So one of, basically just to explain that, we see an increasing number of households using air conditioning and heating in rooms or homes exclusively for pets, particularly when they're not home. Obviously not an issue at the moment, given so many of us are at home, but certainly an issue in the future as we start to move out again. And so this program is about a different form of participation in helping your pet stay comfortable and healthy without needing to run an air conditioner or to use forms of energy at the most demand intensive times of the day. And it's a program, again, just kind of an exemplar program that promotes low energy ways for households to keep their pets warm or cool during extreme weather that doesn't involve essentially running the air conditioning the whole time. And it was also, the program had a number of ideas as well about promoting public venues that would accept pets during extreme weather events, given that so many people go out of the home on very hot days and leave the home without air conditioning running during those times. So again, a kind of another example of what participation could look like if framed through the ways that householders themselves already understand energy and, I guess, manage demand or don't manage demand based on the different needs and expectations they have for those within their home. So yes, this is the central question, I guess, that we keep coming back to. I've added pets in there as well now. How will people and pets live in the future? And as I said at the beginning, any kind of conversation that we have about distributed energy and automation, I think, needs to consider these ways in which people exist and also their expectations for the future, so that we can make sure that we are building programs and we are encouraging technological adoption that is going to kind of head us in the right direction. So I'll leave us there. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Yolande. And there is a dog in the background behind me that you can't see, who was very happy to hear that the energy industry is now thinking about her interests as well. But I think it also speaks to where we've got with users in this space of how they're being factored into the transition that's happening, and the efforts underway to feed that in, which is, I think, shown by all your research. So now we've got the opportunity for Q&A, and we've got some questions that have come in. I might just put one out there from 𝗗𝗁𝗲𝗿𝗀, which Declan's provided a bit of a response to online, but others might want to chip in on. And this was about the 3.6 million people who may skip meals to pay their power bills. 𝗗𝗁𝗲𝗿𝗀 wanted to know if we know more about this issue and what could be done to address it, and whether there are any gains that can be made by switching retail providers or incentivising landlords, etc. So, Declan, I don't know if you want to touch on your response, and then if others have got thoughts to answer it. And if you've got other questions, people, feel free to put them in the Q&A and we'll work through them.
Yeah, look, I mean, this was a figure I got from the recent SBS Insight program, which I would recommend to everyone. It shows that basically poverty, energy poverty, food poverty is a chronic issue in Australia, and it does come up significantly in discussions with the energy industry, and they have been trying to enact programs to give people flexible payment options, and this is really I think a potential flashpoint, particularly between advocates of different automation technologies to help solar owners and some of the more welfare-based advocates in this space who are seeking to ensure that energy as an essential service is not compromised by encouraging new technologies to come online. So I'm just sort of mindful really of this dynamic, but I'd welcome comments from the other panelists as well.
Any other thoughts from others? No, look, you've answered it for everyone. Perfect. All right, a question for you, Mark, from David Prinz around, are your findings a variant of the straw that broke the camel's back, being each person is a camel and the straw is the delta in temperature? Maybe the experiment was within the tolerance of straws, and a bolder move to increase the delta might give different results. Do you want to comment on that one?
Look, I can't talk about camels. I mean, I take Yolande's point about pets, but I think that would probably be pushing it, from a whole bunch of areas, as well as the university's tolerance for that sort of stuff. Look, I guess probably the question is really are people okay with it for a day? Yeah, maybe after a run of 5, if we have a heat wave of 4 or 5 days and the university is allowing building temperatures to keep creeping up over that time, after 4 or 5 days, where are people's tolerance? And it's a good point. And I guess we don't know. And I get the basis for the project that we designed with Scott and his team was, well, rather than anticipate or assume particular responses or particular behaviours, why don't we see what they are first? And I would say that logic holds for that kind of a question as well. Rather than assume this is going to happen and then as a result put in all these systems and engagements in place and find out people respond in a very different way to what we anticipated, test it first. And one of the things I know that Scott and the team are going to be doing is actually running similar trials building by building across the university, because one thing we have also noticed is that it's not just the people, but it's also how the buildings respond. So you kind of have to test these things out building by building rather than just do a broad scale rollout that assumes particular commonalities either between the people in the buildings or the buildings themselves. So sorry, no camels in my answer, Scott, or straws, but hopefully that is a bit of a help.
Anyone else got a comment on that, Yolande?
Yeah, I was just going to mention a study that I came across a while ago from colleagues at Lancaster University. It was called Catch My Drift. Maybe you've come across it, Mark. It was a drifting study of temperature. So what that means is that, and this was done in households, but over time, the temperature incrementally changed. And the idea was actually to implement a system that nobody would notice. That was the deliberate attempt that they were trying to make. I'm not sure how it would get past ethics committees in the social sciences, but this was done in the field of human-computer interaction design. And I always find they seem to get away with, or they seem to do the most radical experiments. So they're a really great group to check out for that. But I can't remember exactly what they found, except that I know, I'm not sure where the threshold was, but for the most part, it did go unnoticed, as I understand. So they were able to just incrementally lower or raise the temperature. I'm not sure what the time difference was, but that did seem to be an effective way of doing that.
Yeah, one of the things we're considering with how both building managers and then the occupants of buildings interact with these systems is how do they set their preferences, and then how can you capture in real time people's responses to the comfort levels in those buildings. So I think we keep moving towards this smarter, more automated system that gets people's feedback, but the reality is the way our buildings are run and cooled at the moment is they're not ideal or optimal for anything. So to Mark's point, people complaining about the coolness of a building on hot days sort of speaks to that. Mark, you've got a rebuttal?
Oh, not a rebuttal, just I guess a further comment. And I mean, to be really clear, we did our study in a workplace, and I guess how people respond to these situations in a workplace, where maybe there is some kind of assumption that everything outside of my job will be taken care of for me. We hand the reins over for a lot of things that we would not tolerate in our own homes, handing the reins over. So, this sort of automation energy user participation debate needs to understand the context specific response, I guess, that we would probably see. And perhaps, in a home, although it's interesting, Yolande, I haven't heard of that study. I have to have a look at it. But, I would imagine that energy users' tolerances for automation might be slightly less in a home compared to in an organisation, because it's, we expect maybe to be able to exert greater control over our lives within our homes as opposed to what we do in a workplace.
Another question here from Alicia Rodriguez, and maybe Sophie and Declan, if you want to have the first crack at this one. Where do you see the barriers, opportunities for social scientists and humanities researchers to work within industry, government to help shift the thinking from consuming energy to consuming meaningful energy services?
Oh, look, that's a fantastic question. I might just have a quick bite at that, which, I mean, this was really the heart of the promise of the transition of marketized energy service delivery back in the 1990s with the neoliberal reforms of 𝗗𝗲𝗄, that this was going to lead to a flowering of all sorts of different business models that would enable energy services to be bundled up. Of course, what we've seen in Australia is something quite different to that. Although it's hard to ignore the power of the three big gentailers, but I do feel like there are a lot of new offerings that are coming online, things like Amber, community energy models that are finding new ways of connecting supply and use. The delivery of meaningful energy services, I would like to think, is going to be part of this sort of next wave of the pluralization of energy offerings in the marketplace. But yeah, we're still quite a long way from arriving at that, I think.
Great. Question here from the Deputy Director of the Monash Energy Institute, Roger Dargaville. This one might be for you, Yolande. Seems that energy management systems are only affordable in high-end homes. Are we expecting a change in how they work, i.e. cheap widgets to control devices controlled with a smartphone, so that energy management is affordable and easily retrofitted to any home?
Well, I think that there are lots of ways in which people manage energy, and some of them may involve quite high-end systems, but I'm always amazed when I go into people's homes just how inventive they can get and how creative they can get at managing their own energy consumption. I mean, there's a large number of apps now that just distributors provide, and where you can just get basic information about your consumption. Some people find that useful, others not so much. But there's also a whole lot of other kind of creative ways, like I was mentioning earlier, that I think people manage their consumption often quite manually. Just weather being a really big one. The number of times I hear people tell me that how they check weather apps to determine when they're going to do things like their laundry, for example, or when they're going to time appliances, maybe turning their air conditioning on, for example, based on the solar generation that day. Those kinds of, we don't think of those as energy management systems, but actually for many people that we speak to, they're more meaningful than the kinds of data that the energy industry might assume people want to look at. What I find with energy data and apps is that people look at it to understand how, you know, what the big appliances are or what things they kind of be mindful of, and then they put it away. You know, it's kind of like, okay, now I know I'll be more cautious about this particular thing, or I can't do anything about that thing. Maybe Roger is also referring to higher end kind of automation systems, and certainly those are really, you know, they're only available to people who are able to afford them, or who actually have their own homes as well, because there's quite a large limit what you can do. But then again, you know, rightly or wrongly, low income households are often the people who are most skilled at managing their energy consumption, and yet they have the least resources in the kind of sense that we might think of in terms of what we need to manage energy than any other people. So I think we also need to be careful about our assumptions of what people need and what they actually use to manage any energy consumption in their home.
Great. Chance for maybe one last question here. So Ron Ben David asks, what happens if we overestimate consumers' interest in thinking about energy, but we go ahead and still design the market, assuming they are heavily engaged and responsive to market or price signals? There's another question further down from James around, what do you think about financial incentives as an appropriate tool to encourage people to, it just jumped on me, just disappeared, to participate or respond to these signals? Let's just.
Sorry, Scott, it's because Scott, I just typed a response to James's question, so that's why I disappeared.
All right, there you go.
Sorry about that.
So who wants to have a go at Ron's and David's semi-combined question there? Seems like you, Mark, given you answered the first part of it. No?
I'm happy to answer the second one. I think I did it amazingly well, but I'll give the space to my other panelists.
Anyone want to, Declan?
Sure, yeah. Look, I mean, I guess this is one of the main tensions in this space between needing to engage consumers to hand over the keys to their devices. And I think Yolande's point about who is engaged and for what reasons is a really important one, and that we should be guided by social science findings here and not our kind of prejudices about wealthy people necessarily being more skilled or more open to economic incentives. And, you know, these do need to be tested and worked through with dialogue. And the work of ECA and Yolande's group and many of our other social science colleagues is, you know, really trying to build capacity to actually feed this back into the energy sector, so that these assumptions are actually based on evidence.
A very, very live question with the Energy Security Board's post-2025 market design work going on now at the moment as well. So we're going to have to call it there. We're smack bang on 12 o'clock. So I wanted to thank all our speakers, Mark, Declan, Sophie and Yolande, for their time and input today. That was very interesting, and also some very common threads coming out there. I want to thank all of you for coming and joining us today. I appreciate All Energy is on this week, so great that you chose to come to this webinar over some All Energy conferences. There are another series of Monash Energy Institute webinars coming up. Go and have a look at the Monash Energy Institute website. And you'll be able to see what's been scheduled in for the rest of the year, and there'll be more scheduled for next year. And thanks to Nancy and Karen, who have been doing the work in the background to bring this together and help produce it on the day. So thank you very much. All right, hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Have a great time.